Wait, what about weird?
The sun has set and the moon is high. We all sit down around the campfire to tell as ghastly a tale as we can remember. So eat your s'mores and enjoy the crackling of the flames as we bring stories from our childhood and hometowns with a haunted twist. Welcome to Campfire Stories with What About Weird, a podcast discussing all things weird that go bump in the night.
Around the time of the Great Depression, in one of the many Hoovervilles, there was a woman named Jenny who was known for being very caring and considerate to others. If she only had one slice of bread, she'd share it with whoever needed it and go hungry because she cared about everyone else. But one day, she was cuddled up next to her fire, wrapped in her tattered blanket, eating her soup. She was so hungry that she was so focused on her soup and didn't notice a stray spark fly out of her fire and land on her skirt, where it quickly set to blazing. Before she knew it, she was fully engulfed in flames, and she ran screaming out of her little lean-to hut, through her little Hooverville, and out across the woods, where she ran across some tracks, yelling and screaming for help. Imagine the surprise of a train conductor as he came barreling down the tracks, only to see the absolutely horrific sight of a woman fully engulfed in flames, running and screaming down the tracks. He did everything he could to try and stop the train, but it had too much momentum, and it plowed into her, sending her body flying. When he finally got the train to a stop, he climbed out to see the horrific sight ahead of him. Unfortunately, she had died. But it wasn't very long until on another cold night, there's a train conductor barreling down that very same run track when he saw, coming out of the woods, a woman fully engulfed in flames, screaming and hollering for her life, and he pulled the brake. He tried to stop, but he couldn't stop before he plowed into her. He was horrified in what he had done. When he got out of the train to see if he could find her, imagine his astonishment when he found nothing. Some say that on cold winter nights, if you go down that track, you can see old screaming Jenny running down the tracks. And maybe, if you are lucky, or some say unlucky, you might see her get plowed into by a train, only to disappear in a blink of an eye.
Here's a story that's been told in my family for generations, told to my father as a child, and then passed on to me. A long time ago, in fact the year was 1948, my grandpa had just moved from Kinsley, Kansas to Colorado and put up a homestead in a rural county. This was right before my father was born and my uncle was a small child. They lived in canvas tents for a few years until the house was built on the land. My great-grandfather, who lived in the area, had a hired farmhand named Frank, who always shaved his head, so they nicknamed him Baldy. My great-grandfather had a habit of collecting the people who were rough around the edges, with a hard work ethic and tough as nails. Baldy was one of these men, the type that always dove right into things head first. One day during harvest time, a header got plugged up in a combination harvester, also called a combine, which is the device used to harvest crops. The header was a sickle header for cutting the wheat, essentially a row of triangles with sharp, jagged edges that move along a line and cut the crop. The blades on the header move incredibly fast, you can hardly see it cutting. A long pole, called a reel, pushes the wheat into the header for it to cut as the combination harvester moves along. This technology was relatively new at the time, and for men in their 30s and 40s, it wasn't what the farmhands were used to. When the header got clogged, they turned off the engine to the combine, but the pulley system that was controlling the header was still taut and engaged. So Baldy goes up to try and unplug it and get it working again. He starts pulling out all the trash and weeds out of the sickles to free it up. He's giving the man who's running the machine grief about getting the machine plugged up in the first place. Now that the header is cleared out, the man running the machine begins to start it back up, but Baldy hasn't finished climbing down. The man wasn't going to actively engage any of the equipment, so it shouldn't have been a problem. But what he didn't know was the gear was still engaged. As soon as the machine was turned on, the reel that pushes the wheat into the header pushes Baldy's hands directly into the blades, shredding them at the wrists, turning his hands into hamburger meat. Blood shoots everywhere, splattering on the machine operator and the two farm hands nearby. Baldy bled out in seconds. Having no family, it was just my grandpa, great-grandpa, and uncle there to mourn him. The farm workers who were there at the time of Baldy's death had nightmares about a bald man and an accident that will lead to their demise. My uncle, who was only 10 years old at the time, was also there to witness Baldy's death, but was far enough away to avoid being splattered by the blood of the unfortunate farmhand. 1 year later, during harvest time, the man who had operated the combine also had a fatal accident and died. Then a year after that, another one of the farmhands who had been sprayed with the blood of Baldy mysteriously disappeared. The third year, the last and final man who had been splattered with Baldy's blood died in an accident during harvest time. Only my uncle was spared. We believe it's due to the fact that none of Baldy's blood touched him. So let it be known, if you don't pay attention while working on the farm and cause the injury of someone near you, Baldy will come for you in your dreams and show you that you may be the next to die.
The story goes that in the 1940s, a couple was driving outside of Statesville when their car broke down. They stopped, they pushed their car off by the side of the road. They were trying to figure out what to do. The husband decided that he would go and look for help to try and get their tire changed. The husband decided to go to town to see if he could find someone to help them fix their car. It was a bit of a crisp night, so the wife decided to stay in the car and wait for her husband. So while she was waiting there, she's looking out at the bridge across the way. She hears a train whistle off in the distance. It gets closer and closer. As she watches, to her horror, the train goes barreling off the side of the tracks into the nearby creek. It crashes in. She barrels out of the car to look out and see what has happened. To her astonished horror, she hears screams and cries of the people in the river drowning and dying. She sits back in the car, shocked and astonished, until her husband comes back. When he comes back with the person to help fix their car, she begs them to go get help to help the people in the creek. He takes her to find some help out in Statesville. When they're talking to someone there, the man that they're talking to mentions, "It's funny you should mention that. On this day of all days, on August 27th, 50 years ago, a train jumped the rails in that very same spot and went plummeting into the creek. And it claimed the lives of 23 people. Some say that if you go out there on August 27th, you may just see this ghost of a train jump the tracks and reenact this fatal plunge that took the lives of those 23 people."
I come to tell you the tale, not of a fictitious ghost story told to me as a child, but a true history of a Colorado park filled to the brim with spirits of the dead. While taking a stroll in beautiful Cheeseman Park, admiring the 150-mile panoramic view, you may not realize you step upon the bodies of thousands that were left there forgotten and neglected. Our story begins in 1858 when a man General William Larimer, under the claim of St. Charles Town Company, established the city of Denver, Colorado. Of course, this land wasn't owned by the company, but was inhabited by the Arapaho indigenous people, but this didn't stop Larimer from claiming it as his own, eventually setting aside a 320-acre plot to act as a cemetery, with several large plots on the crest of the hill to be designated for the wealthy, people of the middle class surrounding the hill, and the poor and unwanted buried at the edges. The first man buried at the park was a man suddenly stricken with a lung infection, sealing the fate of the park to be one where they would dump the bodies of the sick. The second and third men to be buried were brothers of sorts. John Stoffel, after arriving in Denver to settle a dispute about gold dust with his brother-in-law, eventually shot the man and was convicted of murder. He was hanged from a cottonwood tree at the intersection of 10th and Cherry Creek, and afterwards both his and his brother-in-law's bodies were dumped into the same grave at the edge of the cemetery. The outer section of the cemetery began to fill with what the townspeople referred to as outlaws, vagrants, and paupers, and they began to refer to the place as Old Boneyard or Boot Hill. Mount Prospect, supposed to be reserved for the more well-off, gained recognition for an unsavory incident, when professional gambler Jack O'Neill quarreled with a man named Rooker, who then gunned down O'Neill as he passed by the Western Saloon. O'Neill was then buried up on the hill, where people began to call it Jack O'Neill's Ranch. This final nail in the coffin of the cemetery's reputation meant all the influential citizens were buried elsewhere, leaving it a resting place for the poor, criminal, or diseased. Eventually, the founder Larimer left Denver and handed the park over to a cabinet maker who was an aspiring undertaker. At this time, a reported 626 people were buried at the cemetery, but under the care of this new owner, the cemetery fell into disarray as headstones were toppled, graves were vandalized, and cattle were allowed to graze upon the grass. In 1872, the U.S. government claimed the land and gave it to the city of Denver, where its name was changed to Denver City Cemetery. The cemetery was sectioned off into different ethnic groups or religions, such as Odd Fellows, the Society of Masons, Roman Catholics, the Hebrew Burial Society, the Grand Army of the Republic, and a far-away segregated section for Chinese immigrants. While some of these groups maintained their section of the graveyard, many fell even further into disrepair. In 1881, a so-called hospital for smallpox patients was established near the cemetery. The hospital, more often referred to as the pest house, contained many contagious individuals, but also the mildly sick, elderly, and handicapped. Most of the patients at the hospital were left to die, and bodies were buried in mass graves at the Potter's Field section of the graveyard. By the late 1880s, the cemetery was so beyond repair that real estate investors began lobbying for a park instead, and in 1890, Congress gave families 90 days to move the remains of their loved ones to another location. Of course, those with money were able to do so, but thousands of bodies were left behind. When most bodies remained unclaimed, the city of Denver awarded undertaker E.P. McGovern a contract to remove the remains of anyone who was left behind. McGovern was instructed to provide a fresh box for each body and transfer it to the Riverside Cemetery for $1.90 each, about $60 today. While the first few days were orderly, McGovern soon found a way to profit even more from this arrangement. He used child-sized caskets instead, which were only 3.5 feet long, hacking up the bodies to fit them in, and even stuffing some coffins full with the remains of multiple people. In his haste, body parts and bones were strewn about, and souvenir hunters began to loot the open graves and bodies. This act gained publicity, with many reporters at the scene describing in gruesome detail what McGovern was doing. An article titled "The Work of Ghouls" described a scene as follows. The line of desecrated graves at the southern boundary of the cemetery sickened and horrified everybody by the appearance they presented. Around their edges were piled broken coffins, rent and tattered shrouds, and fragments of clothing that had been torn from dead bodies. All were trampled into the ground by the footsteps of the gravediggers like rejected junk. The mayor immediately terminated the city's contract with McGovern, and the grading and leveling of the park began with many bodies still remaining, the land still riddled with open graves. The cemetery was finally fully turned into a park, with all bodies covered and graves filled in by 1907, and upon a generous donation from the Cheeseman family for a pavilion, was named Cheeseman Park. While some of the remains have been removed over time, there are estimated to be over 2,000 bodies left in Cheeseman Park. No wonder strange things have been reported within the park ever since they started removing bodies in the 1890s. Sad and confused-looking people are seen wandering the grounds. Visitors often feel unexplainable sadness or dread when within the park, and you may just hear the whispers and moans of something unseen. Children play and run around the grounds only to disappear into the mist. A woman stands near a park bench and cries for hours, dissolving into the light as the sun comes up the next day. A man stumbles around in his bloodied hospital gown, pleading for someone to help him with his wounds. On some moonlit nights, the outlines of old graves can still be seen, crooked, cracked, and shifting ever so slightly as if something beneath them still remembers.
Thank you for listening. If you liked it, please rate the podcast and share it with the weird people in your life. Follow us on Instagram at whataboutweird.pod, where we often share pictures related to the episode. We're also on Blue Sky as What About Weird Pod. If you have any topic suggestions or weird personal stories, please DM us or email us at whataboutweirdpod@gmail.com. And always remember
To ask about the weird.
Happy Halloween!